Well, that's kind of a complicated three intertangled questions. Let's try to stay brief. In the first place, Baha'u'llah reveals a peace plan. So the reason people have war is because they're fighting about something. There's some difficulty. So war has been used as a means for solving disputes between people or between countries. So what Baha'u'llah offers is a way that we can have the settlement of disputes between countries without having to go to war. So in order for this to happen, we have to have justice. Like peace on earth without justice is tyranny. In other words, if a certain group of people is suffering and they're not able to get their needs met and they're being oppressed by a stronger power, being the Mazlum, then they're suffering and there's no justice there. And the reason there isn't a war is because they're too weak to stand up to get the things that they need. Or if another country takes things away from a third party that another country's involved in, they might want those things or need those things for themselves, whether it's wheat, gas, oil, some other commodity, and necessary things for the survival of their people. So nations and tribes have resorted to war to settle their differences. So it's not so much that war is illegal or banned, but that it's not the productive way to solve human disputes anymore. It's counterproductive and causes more trouble and more problems. And now that the people are civilized inside their countries, there's no longer vast wilderness area like there was many hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago in the city-state system. We now have all these borders and all the countries border each other. There's no reason to have war for the settlement of disputes. Now, if the people of the world accept a universal collective security agreement, which is what Baha'u'llah is talking about, that will eliminate the need of war between the nations, he states that should one of the nations break out of this and invade its neighbor, that all the other nations of the world should stand up against that government and prevent it from being the fomenter of that aggression. So that's war right there. He states that if one of the ones after the Universal Collective Security Agreement is put in place were to break away, that there would be war and that the majority should stay together and stop the aggressor nation from being able to make war. So the Bahai Faith's not pacifistic, but in no way should the Baha'is start a war, an offensive war. And Muhammad himself outlawed offensive warfare. In the religion of Islam, he provided for defensive warfare in case they're attacked. So this is kind of a mythology that's been spread since the 1960s, as if the Bahai Faith is pacifistic, and it's not. The history of the faith shows that the followers of the Bab defended themselves when they were under attack at Fort Sheikh Tabarsi, and even Baha'u'llah was on his way there to give them food and supplies to support them as they were at that time the Mazlum. So of course we have this explanation and true consciousness in the Bahai Faith. When they asked Abdul Baha about this, he said that if the people were to come to take his life because he was a Bahai, he would willingly give his life. But he said if a wild group of bandits broke into the room and tried to harm the women and children and they were just robbing for no reason, he said he would grab a lamp or a chair or anything at his disposal to use as a weapon to stop them from the aggression and protect the people in the room. In another place, Abdul-Baha stated that if a group of insurrection or an army came in to overthrow the village or the town, that the true Baha'i would be the first person in the street with the other people to defend their city against the onslaught of the enemy. But again, he said if they came to kill him or take his life for his religious belief, he would willingly give this. So the Bahai faith is not pacifistic. People are allowed to stand up for their rights and be respected in their personal relationships, and even have a defensive stand to ward off criminals that might have no other reason for attacking than just to burglarize and rob and hurt. But if it's a martyrdom situation where they're accusing us of being Baha'is and they want us to recant our faith or be killed, Abdul-Baha said he would give his life. And on the international level, Baha'u'llah talks about the Universal Collective Security Agreement and how if one nation breaks away, the other nations should defend themselves. And then also in some answered questions, he talks about how individuals should forgive the wrongs that are done to them by others, but that society has the right to protect itself. And he talks about the right treatment of criminals. So those are some of the writings that cover the general idea about what you're asking about. And so no, the Bahai faith is not pacifistic in the least. Now, in the current situation, which is what we're actually talking about, we see that in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, 38, and 39, it describes Russia prophetically. Scholars have pointed this out as Gog and Magog, or Juj and Majuj in Arabic, and that mentioned in the Quran. And it says that God will put hooks in their mouth and drag them down into this war. And Christian scholars of the book of Revelation and other experts that have examined this have talked about the scenario in the book of Revelation being a great battle that will take place as a thermonuclear Armageddon, in which 1/3 of mankind is prophesied to be killed in 1 hour of thermonuclear war, with every American city, a population 100,000 or more, being targeted. And the prophecies talk about Gog and Magog involve Russia and this Ukrainian crisis, and the concept that this war will eventually also engulf the Middle East and drag Israel into the fray of these things. This has kind of been happening because the president of, it's kind of in the works right now, because President Zelensky has a Jewish background and he's been appealing to the state of Israel. And there's been news about Holocaust memorials in the Ukraine that are also destroyed. Well, in the scenario that we have now, we just see the nations fighting each other. And the Bahai faith is really clear that the believers should stay out of politics and stay out of international and national political concerns. And that's kind of what's developing here. But as individuals, we're empowered to teach and educate and enlighten the people. And hopefully we're able to remove veils and bring about a greater depth of understanding. But whatever the crisis is in the Ukraine between NATO and Russia doesn't need and isn't going to be settled by this war. This war is going to destroy the country of the Ukraine and wind up possibly escalating more between the United States, meaning NATO, and Russia. And this is a terrible thing. And the Baha'is that find themselves in the United States and in Russia, if they happen to be drafted into the army, then they're or the military, then they're conscripted to fight and defend for their country. So some of the Baha'is are able to avoid a combat service for the military, and instead they're able to work with the Red Cross or the medical teams or do humanitarian effort to bring food and supplies in. And this is the best thing for the Baha'i people, is not to get involved in the fighting between the different nation states, which is based on what Showqi افندی talks about as three false gods. One of them is nationalism. We don't need to be fighting for nationalism and having a war between nations over nationalism or racism or economic structures, materialism, whether it's communism or capitalism that they're fighting about. Instead, the battle that we have is for the truth. And we want to be able to establish the oneness of humanity in our teaching effort. And this war at the current time in the Ukraine is an opportunity for all people, regardless of their religious or tradition or cultural background or personal spiritual practices, to support a universal collective security agreement, because this is what the world needs. This is will end the need for war, and war has become obsolete. It doesn't actually effectively solve the disputes between people. This war that we're having now is the same war that was World War I. In other words, the purpose of war is to solve a problem. So in the United States in 1812, the British wouldn't let America do shipping. So we had the War of 1812. And the war ended when the British lost and said, okay, we'll let the United States do shipping. So the War of 1812 was caused by a definite reason, and the war resolved the problem. And then they were diplomatic about it. And then we haven't had another war about shipping between the United States and Britain since that time. Now, the causes behind World War I, if you study them, they were not resolved by World War I. And these same things that caused World War I is what gave rise to World War II. And World War II did not resolve the reasons behind that time frame either. And today, we're seeing this war in the Ukraine, which the pundits on television are talking about World War III and thermonuclear war possibility right now. And the problems behind what's happening in the Ukraine and with Russia and NATO are the same problems that were there, that were at the foundation of World War II, and the same problem that was at the foundation of World War I. In other words, the problems that are at the foundation of World War I, which is in World War II, this World War III, can't be resolved by war. That otherwise World War I and World War II would have settled the problem. So war has become obsolete. It's no longer a matter of city-states where we can conquer another one and make sure our territories and borders are secure and that we're treated fairly by our neighbors by having a violent skirmish. The other reason they used to have war is inside the areas where they were governed. One dynasty would be pulled down and another dynasty would come to power, and they would do this through revolution or a war. And instead of what we can have today, which is people electing the governments and rotating them that way through having an election and in terms of office, if a government and the people in it are weak at some point, whereas they used to be vibrant and strong, the people can re-elect ones who can be public servants that will strengthen the government and improve the management of human affairs. The other problem is, and then I'll stop talking about this part of it, is that people kind of have a concept in their mind that government is somehow more important than other things, or that like government rules or has power or governs the world or is in charge of over things. And that's just ridiculous. This is a childish concept that people have in their mind that go back to the Middle Ages and thousands of years ago, where they thought like if a king had an army and they were strong and they conquered a land, that this was a demonstration of power and authority. And it's just muscle. It's just a might makes right philosophy. The same way if we see two boxers get in the ring and one of them stronger and prevails, we say that person's powerful and the champion of the boxing ring. or something like this. This is part of the problem. And what we see that government really is a bureaucracy. In other words, it's management. It's people in a position to manage the affairs in an intermediary way, so everything else that's really important in society can flow smoothly. The government's supposed to be a well-oiled machine. We don't want to ever hear about the government. We don't want to know about it. We want it functioning correctly. If the mail's delivered and people are able to do trade and commerce, and food is being grown, and schools are open in the local area, and the roads are taken care of, and there's a settlement for disputes between citizens at a court that they can go before a judge and get decisions made. The government is just the middle management people that make sure that that everything else that's important that people are doing in their human occupations flows smoothly. So when we look at the entire planet Earth as a global village, and we see these different neighborhoods, like the neighborhood, we use the Great Pyramid of Giza is the geographic center of the Earth. So everything west of it, we call the West, and everything east of it, we call the East, pretty much. But there is no north, south, east, and west on the planet. These are man-made concepts and constructs, but we use the pyramid as a reference point. So the neighborhood in the east in China is one of the neighborhoods in this global village. Russia's another neighborhood. America's another neighborhood. South America's a neighborhood. Europe's a neighborhood. The Middle East is a neighborhood. Africa, Australia. These are like different neighborhoods in one global village. And the global village is being mismanaged because people think that they can take control over it and own it and rule it and boss other people around. That's not the purpose of government. This concept is a foreign concept to God. This concept came into play after the flood, historically, after the time of Abraham, when Nimrod and his wife Semiramis became the builders of the Tower of Babel and became the first empire builders. And now we have this concept of domination and army and control. He's one of the first ones that set up a standing army and a tax on the people to pay for the army and militarize the planet. We don't need to live in a police state on the planet. We don't need a militarization of planet Earth or any of our cultures or any of our countries. This is barbaric thinking. So this is the problem when we say, well, does the Bahai Faith outlaw war? Well, it pretty much gives a revelation that's against the insistent self. Abdul-Baha states our one crusade, which is a war, is against our own insistent self, the nafs samara, the commanding self. And this is the plane of existence that we live in. This entire life on earth is like the valley of search. And when we die and go into the next world, we transition between the valley of love and these other valleys on like a cosmic, supernatural plane of existence. In another way, we go through the 7 valleys 7 days a week in our life, which is how we grow and transform personally and spiritually. So the people are just completely off base if they're fighting over rule, power, control, and authority over the material heap of things here on planet Earth, playing king of the hill. This is not what true government is. True government is a management system that helps provide for the flow of goods and services and communications and a settlement for disputes without violence for the people through some sort of court or consultative system. And the people should be able to elect their local and state and international representatives in the government on the legislative side. And the earth would be a global village. And once the borders are defined and who the administrators are over the different zones that they need to work in to make things flow better, there's no reason for having war to grab more territory. If a country did need more territory, they should be able to purchase it just outright. And if another place is willing to sell it, then that is well and good. And if there's a dispute about it, it can go to court. and they can come up with a reasonable way to settle it through consultation and council meetings. And by court, I just don't mean a judge ruling, but I mean by a vote of the people that are concerned. And the reason we have to do this is everything's interdependent now. There's no longer these independent city-states, and even the nation states have filled up their borders to a point where we're all interdependent. So war is counterproductive. It's become obsolete, and people can see this now with the war in the Ukraine, and that's the main thing. If people are already in these armies, then they have to fulfill their obligations or try to change their role in the military if they're involved. And for Baha'is, they can definitely move to the medical corps and the assistance. And for people that are Baha'is that are not in the military, they can certainly stand by absolutely the Muslim and supply people with food and supplies and clothing, and help refugees as well as soldiers if they're wounded through the Red Cross and things like that. But this is a very difficult situation. That's why the Baha'is don't want to go against the strict writings that say that we're not to take sides in nationalism versus nationalism, because we're world citizens and we're in favor of the oneness of humanity, and we want to get the message out of how we can have a global village and a universal collective security agreement and this whole new paradigm of the reason that we're on planet Earth in the first place in the physical world is to use our effort to gain qualities and attributes to win our station, which is the perfection of ourself and the spiritual powers and forces that we'll need when we go into the next world. And the way that we do this isn't abstract, but the way that we gain those spiritual qualities and attributes while we're in this world is through the knowledge of God, the love of God, faith, philanthropic deeds, severance from the things of this world, sanctification of ourselves, and holiness for ourselves. And we do this by walking the spiritual path with practical feet. We have to engage in the world in a positive way that is our personal humanitarian teaching effort to all the people in our life, as well as the occupation that we have. So we're directly engaged in the process right now. And the majority of the Baha'i councils around the world have already written to the world leaders, talking to them about this current crisis and what the Universal Collective Security Agreement would look like, but it's still up to them to implement it or not. So undoubtedly, we'll see it implemented either before this war escalates into something horribly thermonuclear, or definitely after we would have a thermonuclear exchange. This is still the only option that'll be left on the table, is to have some peaceful settlement. So Baha'is are not pacifists, but on the other hand, we're not going to engage in this war between nations over oil and gas. That's clearly a Christian dispute between the Eastern Orthodox and the Pope and the Western Christians and their governments and their people. In fact, the reason that they're Christian is Christianity itself has enshrined in its holy books. Muhammad said knowledge is 27 letters, and these 27 letters are the 27 epistles and books of the New Testament, has the knowledge in it that's enough to get Russia and the United States to become allies and for the Christian East and West to stop fighting. So we're hoping that at some point in this debacle, they will pay attention to this, because it's just horrible watching the death and destruction of the sick and the elderly and children and families in the Ukraine, and seeing the cities completely flattened like Mariupol and so forth. And people are realizing that war doesn't work and it is obsolete. And we're very hopeful that this is what's going to come out of the current crisis. And so, yes, it's important for the Baha'is to have a good perspective on that. Also, I would recommend for the Baha'is to search through the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi. It talks more about this specifically in those sacred texts.